May your teachings enlighten us, O Lord, and may we be prepared for your coming. Please be seated. As Maureen commented in her sermon a few weeks ago, those of us on the lay preaching team are always anxious about the lectionary, which determines the content of the sermons we prepare. When I first saw the topic of the gospel for this Sunday, my first reaction was, 10 bridesmaids crashing in on the wedding night? What is the lesson here? Be sure to get good seats? Make sure the lighting is right? But then, of course, I quickly realized the significance of the parable Jesus is relating to his disciples as he sits with them on the Mount of Olives. Going back to Matthew 24, Jesus is responding to questions from his followers about end times and the second coming. He predicts the destruction of the temple, warns that many will come in his name, recounts the awful horror of which Daniel spoke, about the coming of the Son of Man and the lesson of the fig tree, and counsels that no one knows the day and the hour except the Father. Looking forward to the gospel we will hear in 2 weeks, he says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, he will sit upon the throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him. In today's gospel message, he tells the parable of the 10 bridesmaids to teach us the significance of being prepared for the most important event in our future. In Jesus' time, weddings were very big events. The betrothal, which took place sometime before the marriage, was a kind of solemn marriage contract, but preliminary to its final consummation. When the time for the celebration of the marriage came, the bridegroom came to the house of the bride at night and brought her to his own house. The virgin bridesmaids awaited his coming and attended the bride to the marriage feast. It might be days before the bridegroom came, and no one knew when he would come. They didn't text or tweet back then. So it was important for the bridesmaids to be ready and prepared on a moment's notice. Of course, this parable is about the second coming of Christ. In a world where Christ may come at any moment, we must be ready. The bridegroom is Christ. The bridesmaids are you and I. Sufficient oil in the lamps represents our preparation. I suppose preparation can seem kind of boring and not a very inspiring concept. But let's all remember a very dramatic and recent event. On January 15th, 2009, just 3 minutes after taking off from LaGuardia Airport in New York City, U.S. Airways Flight 1549 struck a flock of birds in midair. With the loss of both engines and only seconds to make a critical decision at 3,000 feet above the Hudson River, all of the crew's training and preparation came into play. The pilot, Captain Chesley Sullenberg from Alamo, California, co-pilot and crew, who had logged many hours of flight time, maintained a steady demeanor that helped to sustain the passengers' confidence during this intense situation. Also, the first responders from ferry boats and nearby acted quickly to make sure everybody got to shore safely. The remarkable result was that all 155 people aboard survived with reports of only relatively minor injuries. The remarkable skills of the pilot and crew became known as the Miracle on the Hudson. Yet even a miracle alone could not have accounted for the amazingly safe ditching of an aircraft. A significant part of the credit lies in preparation. As the disaster loomed, the crew and rescue teams calmly and consistently implemented what they had learned in years of training and emergency drills. No one involved had ever undergone a situation like this one. And yet their countless hours of experience and preparation combined to achieve the best possible outcome, an inspiring and successful rescue. This is what Christ is counseling us to do, to be prepared for the day of destiny. For most of us, I think we think of that day as the day of our death. But in Jesus' time, it's probable that they thought the day was not far off. Even though Jesus cautions us that no one knows when the hour or day will come, not even the Son, only the Father, it does not keep us curious humans from speculating. And it is clear that the disciples, and many who followed them, thought the day would be coming during their lives. In 110 A.D., Ignatius said, "The last days are upon us. Weigh carefully the times. Look for him who is above all time, eternal and visible." Hippolytus wrote in 236 A.D. that Christ was sure to come by 500. In 370 A.D., Martin advised there's no doubt that the Antichrist has already been born. Firmly established in his early years, he will, after reaching maturity, achieve superior power. And in 1500s, Martin Luther predicted that we had no more than another 100 years. And even Christopher Columbus said the year was 1656. The Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses were started by men who were sure of the date that they had calculated. And as many of you may remember, Pastor Harold Egbert Camping, the evangelistic radio broadcaster, predicted 3 dates: September 6, 1994, and more recently, May 21st and October 21st of 2011. He put all his credibility and the prestige of his radio station behind his calculations, and thousands of his followers were all packed and ready to go. And of course, nothing happened. To his credit, he later confessed that he had sinned and was ashamed of himself for ignoring Jesus' admonition. He died shortly afterward, so he probably knows more about it now. Back to the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. Have you ever heard the story of Jeff and Janelle's first date? Janelle was expecting Jeff to present himself timely. She was all dressed up and waiting patiently. However, he was an hour late, so she figured she'd been stood up. She took her makeup off, put on her pajamas, and gathered around her all her favorite junk foods, and sat down on the couch to watch TV with the dog. Then the doorbell rang. It was Jeff. He stared at her wide-eyed and said, "I'm 2 hours late and you're not ready yet?" Pastor Sneed made 3 observations about today's lesson. There is a challenge and a warning related to the second coming. The kingdom has a door that can and does close. And this parable also has a warning that the time of arrival is unknown and speculation is pointless. In chapter 24 of Matthew, the disciples asked Jesus what the signs will be at the end of the age. And Jesus tells them, "Keep watch, because you do not know what day your Lord will come." Again, we're back to preparation. And sometimes preparation is dictated by the circumstances. There's a true story from the sinking of the Titanic. A frightened woman found her place in a lifeboat, about to be lowered into the raging North Atlantic. She suddenly thought of something she needed, so she asked permission to return to her stateroom before they cast off. She was granted 3 minutes, or they would leave without her. She ran across the deck that was already slanted at a dangerous angle. She raced through the gambling room, with all the money that had rolled to one side, ankle deep. She came to her stateroom and quickly pushed aside her diamond rings and bracelets and necklaces as she reached to the shelf above her bed and grabbed 3 small oranges. She quickly found her way back to the lifeboat and got in. 30 minutes earlier, she would not have chosen oranges over the smallest diamond, but death had boarded the Titanic. One blast of its awful breath had transformed all values. Instantaneously, priceless things had become worthless, and worthless things had become priceless. And at that moment, 3 small oranges were an excellent choice over all the diamonds in the world. Just as oil for their lamps was so important to the bridesmaids, and the 5 who had oil were not about to share with those who had neglected to prepare. Speaking of being prepared, I came across a story that I wanted to share with you and work into the sermon. So let's just say it comes as part of preparing the sermon. A young grandson called to wish his grandmother a happy birthday. He asked how old she was, and she told him 80. The grandson was quiet for a moment, and then he asked, "Did you start at 1?" All this going on about bridesmaids, lamps, and oil. What Jesus is telling us is to lead our lives in accordance with God's teachings and to be reverent and faithful. Then we will be prepared for the most important event of our lives, even though we don't know when it will come. It's as simple as that. But it's the very essence of our faith, and oh, so important.